Hi, welcome back to our lecture. This is Jason Baker. Now that you know a little bit about cloud computing, let's talk about Amazon Web Services specifically. Amazon Web Services, or AWS, is the cloud platform that we're going to be using throughout this semester. AWS was considered the first public cloud platform. It was started in the early 2000s. Chris Pinkman and Benjamin Black were two engineers at AWS or Amazon at the time, and they approached Jeff Bezos with this idea. They described how they thought a modern infrastructure should look like and how it ought to be deployed, and how Amazon could sell this sort of infrastructure as a service. So Bezos liked their idea and told them go off and start building this stuff and we'll try to sell it. The first service that they launched was a service called Simple Queue Service, or SQS. And that service was launched in 2004. We'll learn a little bit about SQS in a future lecture. And they followed that service up with two other services, S3 and EC2, in 2006. Now, a lot of people think that they think that the first service launched by AWS was the computing service or the storage service, but actually it was this queuing service, which strikes a lot of people as being sort of strange. But if you think about Amazon's business, it doesn't seem strange at all. Amazon's business is all about managing a supply chain and distributing products to customers and managing products orders using this vast e-commerce platform. So everywhere you look within Amazon's business model, you'll find queues. So the queues really form the heart of their platform, and it makes sense that one of the first services they would build and launch would be a queuing service. Amazon today, and this is Gartner statistics from 2017, from a year ago. I believe these statistics pretty much continue to hold true. Amazon, as a cloud computing provider, is 10 times larger than the next 14 largest cloud computing providers combined. Let that sink in for a moment. Amazon is 10 times larger than the next 14 competitors combined. They're absolutely massive. They're the 800-pound gorilla in the cloud computing space. Nobody else even comes close. I think the next closest competitor today might be Microsoft Azure. And what's interesting about Azure is that a good portion of their cloud computing revenue actually comes from Office 365 hosting. So in terms of like comparing the computing and storage and all of the other cloud computing services that Amazon provides, comparing those to Microsoft, it's just not even close right now. Uh, those other providers like Microsoft and Google and others are growing, so they're starting to gain some growth and get some traction, but they still pale in comparison to the size of Amazon today. Amazon.com, the website and platform, runs on top of the same sort of technology as AWS, but Amazon.com doesn't actually run within AWS. So Amazon.com runs on its own separate partitioned infrastructure and data centers. It's not running alongside of your EC2 instances or your S3 storage. But Amazon is using the same sort of technology that AWS uses to run its own business. In other words, Amazon eats its own dog food. So why are we using AWS in this course? Well, the AWS platform it uses and it contains many of the different services used by other cloud computing providers. If you understand how to use AWS, then it's uh, then you should be able to understand how to use many of the other services provided by by other cloud providers. What you'll find is that other providers like Microsoft and Google, they provide some of the same services as AWS, but those services are just named a little bit differently. They might be configured slightly differently and deployed slightly differently, but most of the key concepts are the same. I also believe that as an IT professional working with organizations today in this modern age, that you absolutely need to understand how to use AWS. I think it's table stakes for working in a modern IT organization. If there's one cloud computing provider that you have to understand, it's AWS. Even if your organization doesn't use AWS currently, or even if you use some other cloud computing provider, I think if you want to have a if you want to have a mobile career path, if you want to have flexibility and the ability to work with multiple companies, then I think you just need to understand how to use AWS. I think it's important. Third, our university is an AWS educational partner, meaning that we can provide students with educational credits, $100 a year educational credits to use AWS infrastructure. And then finally, this course is based around the AWS Solution Architect Certification Blueprint, meaning that after you complete this course, you will have been exposed to about 75% of the curriculum that is tested on the AWS Solution Architect exam. You'll be well along your way to being able to take that exam. Now, I don't think you could complete this course and then go and then immediately take the solution architect exam, because I think you need to get a little bit of experience working with AWS first, out in the real world. However, this course provides a great foundation for that certification training. AWS provides dozens and dozens of different services as part of their ecosystem of services. This slide here doesn't even represent all of the services that are available. It really need to. I don't even think I could fit all of the AWS services into uh, this one slide today, because every single year AWS, every single quarter actually of every year, AWS is launching and introducing new services into their ecosystem. I just wanted to give you sort of uh, an overview of the services that are available, just so you understand that there's a wide variety of different services offered in the ecosystem. AWS and Amazon's concept here in as they build out their cloud computing platform is that an IT organization or a business should be able to find and it should be able to meet every single need within the AWS platform. There should be no reason that a company needs to go and buy services and infrastructure from another competing provider. AWS can provide everything that a business needs. And I think that's mostly true today. Now, we don't have time in this course in the 14 lectures or the 14 the course dates to cover the entire AWS ecosystem. That would be nearly impossible. Instead, we're going to focus on a subset of the services provided in this ecosystem. We're going to focus on mostly the infrastructure or sort of core infrastructure services like the core compute services, EC2, and we'll focus on some of the storage services such as S3 and EBS. We'll also look at many of the different networking services like VPCs and elastic load balancers. We'll look at internet gateways and Route 53. And then we'll also look at some of the other services, management sort of services like identity access management. We'll talk about CloudTrail. We'll look at database services such as RDS, Elasticache, and DynamoDB. We'll use CloudFormation and some of the other management services. So we'll cover about maybe 50% of the services that are available within the AWS ecosystem. And of those services, we'll primarily focus on maybe half of those. So we'll cover in detail, in depth, 25 to 30%, I think, of the services that are available on AWS. But these really form the core services that the vast majority of business customers using AWS utilize today. AWS infrastructure is located all over the world. AWS is truly a global cloud computing platform. This map represents the current AWS locations where AWS is providing computing and storage resources. The circles with the number in them represent a geographic location where resources are being provided, and the number represents the number of what we call availability zones within that particular location. So you can see that Amazon offers services in both North and South America, services across Europe, and services across Asia and Australia. And now they're beginning to build out services in the Middle East region. And I believe they ultimately have some services planned in the future in Africa, potentially in the South African region. The circles that are empty represent locations that are being built out as we speak. So these are regions that are not currently available, but will be available in the near future. Amazon partitions its global services into regions. And so if I go back to this previous slide, each circle represents a region that's available within AWS. Now, it looks like some of these regions overlap, but if you were to sort of zoom in on each one of these areas, you would see that these aren't as close as you might think. For example, this is the US East 1 region out in the Virginia area, so it's on the East Coast, whereas this circle here represents the US East 2 region, which is in Ohio. So these regions are quite a distance apart from one another. So AWS partitions its global infrastructure into these different regions, and each region is partitioned into multiple availability zones. Now, these availability zones represent distinct locations within each region. And each availability zone has one or more data centers located within it. And the availability zones are located a significant distance apart, and that's to provide for fault tolerance and higher availability. You could spread your computing resources across multiple availability zones within a region, and that's to minimize the risk of some sort of problem with a particular availability zone. For example, you might have an availability zone that is struck by a tornado or a hurricane or some sort of other natural disaster. Or maybe an availability zone is struck by some sort of like fire, or maybe a plane crashes into a data center. I mean, there are all kinds of crazy things that could happen to a data center facility. So Amazon has set up these multiple availability zones, multiple data centers within a particular region. And then as a customer, we can decide which region we want to run our computing and storage infrastructure in, and which availability zone or zones within a region we want to deploy our infrastructure. One thing I should note is that each availability zone has its own identifier. And these availability zone IDs are purely abstractions within a region. If you have like two customers and each customer is using, let's say, US East 1, then the availability zones that the first customer sees are going to be different than the availability zones that the second customer sees. Amazon is providing each customer with a list of availability zones, and these availability zones are being dynamically generated. That means that if the first customer is using availability zone 1 within that region, and the second customer is using availability zone 1, those two availability zones might not actually be the same physical location or the same physical availability zone within that region. Amazon is providing an abstraction and is going to give each customer its own set of their own set of availability zones that they can use. So those availability zones are going to be different than the availability zones used by other customers.